Welcome to this first session of Webhooks by Example, where we demonstrate real use cases for webhooks from development through to production. In each session, we introduce practitioners working with webhooks day to day, some from vendors that produce webhooks, others from companies that ingest and put them to use. We walk through the use case, the architecture, the development workflow, the demo, and learn some key tips. In this first session, Jeff Everhart from Knock walks us through how Knock uses all webhooks to power customer upgrade nudges. So here's our first guest. Here's Jeff.
Awesome, Phil. Thanks so much for having me. Really excited to talk webhooks with you today.
Great to have you. Yeah, thanks very much for agreeing to join this and sharing your knowledge. So yeah, if you could give a bit of an introduction to yourself and also who you work for, that'd be great.
Sure thing. So my name is Jeff Everhart. I'm on the developer relations team at a company called Knock. So Knock is what we call customer engagement infrastructure. And we're kind of like a developer first messaging product for messaging your end users through email, SMS, push, Slack, Microsoft Teams. And the use case I'm here to talk about today is around us actually ingesting webhooks to power a usage-based billing upgrade notice.
Okay, very interesting. I mean, every single product you use there, you mentioned there, must produce webhooks as well. So webhooks
yes.
in, webhooks out, likely.
Yes. And we do also produce webhooks for all of those message events as well.
Right, okay. Okay, very interesting. Yeah, I mean, you tend to find that lots of businesses and companies and developer platforms will be producing as well as consuming events. So fantastic. Yeah, so could you go into the use case a little bit more and talk about the problem it solves, the architecture?
Sure thing. So I think, so this use case is probably common to a lot of like usage-based or developer or infrastructure products, right? You kind of give your customers or your developers like a set quantity of, units that they consume. And so in our case, obviously those are messages. So we have all of these different plan types where on our developer plan, you can get started for free and we support up to like 10,000 notifications a month. And then on the starter plan, we obviously support up to $50,000. That's our first paid plan. We support up to 50,000 notifications a month. And so the reason that we kind of implemented this is just to keep developers in the loop as to where they are relative to that billing threshold as they're going through their billing cycle. Because kind of the last thing that we want to do is have somebody get surprised with overages. And obviously, like as a notification messaging company, right, that's really important that we communicate in a really proactive way around those limits. And so the way that we've kind of constructed that is we use a usage-based billing platform called Orb. I think a lot of other tech companies tend to use Orb, and there are a couple of other competitors in that space as well. And so as our customers go, about their business, sending messages to their customers, we track those events. And then when they get close to these different thresholds, we'll fire off webhooks from Orb that our application then ingests. And then we actually use Knock. So it's a little bit of meta dog fooding here to send some of those messages out to our customers. And, the language and what they see differs based on what plan they're on and, which threshold that they've burst through basically.
Okay, yeah, very good. We're also Orb customers. So
okay.
Definitely
I feel like a lot of people use Orb.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a good overview. So you mentioned you've got an architecture diagram. Do you want to share your screen?
Yeah, absolutely.
Walk through that.
I'll walk you through kind of how this works from a high level, right? And so again, this is all triggered based around like our customers' actions. So what they're doing with their customers. So when one of our users inside of their app makes an API call to trigger a workflow, which is sort of Knock's primitive for organizing all of the different messaging channels. So when they trigger a workflow or when they make an API call to show an in-app message, that hits our basically like our notification data plane, which is an Elixir backend. And so obviously that's going to go ahead and process through the workflow because in addition to having all of the message steps, we have all these logical function steps too that it needs to process. So like if there are delays or batches or throttles, it will process those things as well, determine what needs to get sent and where, and also like looks at users' preferences and stuff to determine what messages it needs to send. And so when we produce those messages, we'll obviously send those to a downstream provider, whatever you've got configured. So SendGrid, Resend, whether it's Firebase, whatever sort of providers you've chosen, will generate those outbound messages. And then each one of those outbound messages becomes an event that we record back in Orb. And so Orb records those events, and then based on the user's, what plan they're on, how close they are to the billing threshold, it may kick off these webhooks. And so right now we've got it set up so that we will receive webhooks when a user on the free plan or our kind of first sort of not really pay as you go, but first paid plan, gets to the 75, 90, or 100% threshold. And then we'll kick off, these message that webhook, or we'll send that webhook. And then our control plane application, which is an Elixir and Next.js monorepo, will kind of ingest that. And then we actually trigger a workflow back into Knock, right? So we sort of are using our own product here to do the messaging. And so it'll ingest the webhook. We do a little bit of transformation here because the Orb webhook doesn't have all of the information we need to alert the right people. So we ingest this.
So you're doing enrichment there, not just changing the payload, but also going out to external sources, right? Okay.
Good clarification. Yeah. So we're transforming the payload in a ways I can sort of show once we get into the actual code. And then also enriching it. We're finding out, getting some information about the account, all of the admins and owners that are listed on the account, as well as going back out to Orb to basically augment some of the statistics so that we can display those in the end email that gets sent to our customers. And then obviously when we trigger that workflow, we just, again, are going back to that notification data plane right there.
So regarding the sending the subscription to the webhooks from Orb, do you know if there's a topic-based subscription? Are there certain event types that
there are certain event types, and if I click over here into my demo, I actually have this subscription.usage exceeded event linked in here. So we can just kind of open up this doc. And I do believe that it is a pre-configured quantity. So, issued when a billable metric in a subscription exceeds whatever threshold that you've set. And here are some of the properties that you get sent through that webhook payload.
Okay. All right. Very cool. Well, great. I mean, I can see the business case it solves. I can visualize the components you've got as you walk through them. Think about the data flow. So anything else you want to share about this setup, or is it demo time?
I think it might be demo time, and we can definitely come back here if there's anything else we want to touch on as we go. But I got two maybe demos that we can look at. Let's go to the high level conceptual demo, and then I'll sort of show you what this looks like from end to end, basically. So obviously, I just set up this little dashboard, and I've used this sort of demo style to demo a lot of the different primitives that we have around messaging. But you can see here, we can just sort of start to send some messages. And obviously I'm on the developer plan. So as I send messages, I get closer and I sort of start to breach these different thresholds.
Great demo.
And thanks. I really love this, and spent a lot of time working with V0 on the animations here. So it's kind of cool. So cool. So that's basically right. You just saw a developer plan send through their out of app messages, right? So that would be email, push.
I've engaged with my customers in a bunch of legitimate ways, but I'm at my plan threshold limit.
Yeah. And so that's what this part looks like. And then I'll just sort of show you Knock, and then we'll hop into the code, and then maybe we can hop back and forth a little bit. So this is the base primitive for our event-based messaging at Knock, and this is something that we call a workflow, right? And so I've got this basic usage alert workflow here, and then we trigger that via API call, which, I sort of talked about here. That's how you would trigger these event-based actions. And so we've got this, and it takes, a bunch of the data in this payload that we'll look at more specifically here in just a second. And then this gives people, and, so then this makes a little bit of the, notification infrastructure aspect available to more folks in the organization. And so when we as a team approach setting this up in production, it was a very collaborative process for us. And so I did kind of bits and pieces of it. We had a back-end engineer do, parts in the Elixir code base, and then we actually had our growth marketer come in here and do some of what you're going to see inside this workflow. And so everything starts around this API trigger where we pass in this data payload, and then we can use these different function steps to make decisions. And so here we've got this branch, and we're just encoding some branching logic in here and looking at, what is the percentage used of that particular metric. And then we're sending some different messaging based on that, which we can dig into here in a second. But one of the cool things about Knock is that obviously, since we sort of started out as a little bit more of an infrastructure focused product, our observability is really good. And so you can come in here and we can actually dig through each one of the workflow runs that I just kicked off through that demo and sort of do like a stack trace through its decision-making process. So we can see here, hey, this was the payload that actually got sent with this message. Here was a condition, so it's not an enterprise plan, so we continued. And then down here, we looked at the percentage used, determined that it was greater than or equal to 1. So we sent this particular message right here. And so that's kind of like a high-level overview of, I think, how all of this stuff might fit together. But let's actually hop into Cursor real quick, and I'll get a little bit more specific because I do think there's a lot of things that we're doing behind the scenes with the webhooks before they actually reach Knock in this way. So let me hop into Cursor real quick. And I think most of what I want to talk through today is like just in this one route.ts file, because since it's a billing platform, right, like maybe not everybody has access to it. So what I ended up needing to do this demo and for us to do a bunch of the development work on the templates was basically just mock up a bunch of fake data payloads. And so like I've got a bunch here that represent what we send to Knock, but also, having to do that with what we receive from Orb. And so this is what an Orb usage record looks like, where we've got, some basic information, and it doesn't tell the whole story, right? Which I think is often the case with a lot of different type of webhook technologies. Like you might get an alert about an event, but then ultimately, to your point earlier, Phil, you need to go and you need to do some transformation. You might need to do some enrichment to pull different data out of different systems. And so that's definitely what we had to do here. And so here's what it looks like. We've got a percentage used. In certain cases, like once you're on a paid plan, and if you burst your threshold, then you start accruing overages. So there might be like an overage amount here that we alert you about. We also have basically two different metrics that we track. One for out-of-app messages, basically, so message volume, and then the other one is for our in-app message product. It's more about user-based tracking. So how many like people have seen in-app messages, and that's like a notified recipient. And then we've got some information about their usage period, start and end, plan limit, quantity that we use to drive some of this down below. But basically what we need to do here before we actually send this off to Knock, and again, if I flip back into Google, right, this would be, Orbs over here. We've received that Orb webhook event, and then we're back over here in the control plane where we're actually going to do some of this enrichment. And so this process, we get this Elixir worker basically receives that request from Orb, that webhook, with a payload containing a subscription ID and the usage threshold. And so then we've got to basically go and look up more information about that account to drive some of the downstream messaging. So we look at the account and the subscription. We gather all of the different account seats who are owners or admins. And these are the people that we've kind of determined who are going to be notified. And then we also go and run another query back to Orb to basically get like a little bit more detailed information about each metric. And so you'll see here when I show some of the messaging that like we sort of show both of those metrics independently, because it's possible, that like you've used all your message volume, but you haven't shown that many in-app messages or got what we call them guides to people. Those are two things that can move independent of one another. And like, obviously we want to give people the most specific information that we can. And then we do some transformations on the payload just to make it a little bit easier for the people who are creating the messages to actually use those dynamic values inside of the message templates. And so we kind of just like move a little bit of that data around after we've fetched that new set from Orb. And then we go ahead and just trigger that this Knock workflow up here. And again, this is what it will look like to trigger kind of any event-based messaging in Knock. And so, we pass this trigger, we tell it which workflow we want to trigger, who we want to trigger it for, and then we pass in all of this data that drives a bunch of like dynamic values downstream in the message templates.
So in your enrichment, are you getting the data? Are you going back to Orb because the payload itself doesn't contain enough information. Are you also querying some of your internal systems to get additional information?
Correct. Yeah, that's where we query some internal systems right
okay.
here to look up basically the owners of the account. Because really we just get, hey, this account has exceeded its threshold. And here's the particular one of the two metrics, right? Because usually it's not both. It's that they've sent too many messages or they've shown too many in-app guides. And then we obviously, when we show the message, we want to show them both of those values. So we've first got to look up all of the account owners, determine who's we should trigger that workflow for, and then go back out to orb and get both sets of current usage data.
Yeah, okay. So it's an interesting kind of pattern. Quite often you need to do that enrichment, but there's also kind of idempotency or out of order event considerations that companies like Stripe now are offering thin events where you basically just get the notification, hey, something related to this record has changed. And then you have to do the enrichment. You go back to the provider and say, okay, let me get the latest version of the data in addition to anything else that I needed, that enrichment. Because so often with webhooks, you haven't quite got all the information you need. And I get it from a provider like Orb's perspective, it's difficult to instantly know what your use case is.
For sure. And to like speak to that a little bit and just the patterns that I've seen is like you have kind of basically two different profiles of, I guess, overage here that I see when I actually look at our production usage. And it's either kind of somebody who's on the slow ramp, right, where they're using a relatively stable volume of messages or guides every day, and they kind of just trickle up like this. And, you know, maybe they get toward the end of their billing cycle and they've bursted it, you know, but it's only by a little bit, right? So the delta between, you know, the usage value when we receive the webhook and like when we enrich it isn't that different. But in a lot of cases, the other profile that we see is somebody who's like comes through and it's a burstable sort of pattern, right? Where they've gone through and sent a large broadcast, because we also, in addition to having event-based workflows like this, we also have a broadcast feature. So I could come in and say, well, send all of my, 10, 20,000 users an email right now. And we'll see people come through and do this sort of burstable pattern where they end up using a lot of volume really quickly. So I do think in that case, to your point, like it's a good reason why I might send like a thin payload from Orb and then understand there's some latency. And so then I can go back and get the latest metrics.
Yeah, by the time you've kind of triggered the email notification, if you want to put the figures into the kind of email, the SMS or whatever, it's already out of date because, as you say, the volume is so high.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. Cool. So this is kind of what this part looks like. And then maybe I could hop back into the dashboard a little bit and just show you what these individual messages look like. Cause I do think this is an interesting part of the use case. And definitely something that you should kind of consider if you're doing usage-based billing alerts. Like we learned a lot, I think, about how to do these well. Cause again, like, part of what you're trying to do here, I think, is like communicate some level of urgency without ultimately like scaring anybody. And like, we don't want anybody to feel like we were going to shut off their service or anything like that if they bursted these limits. And so just having like really clear communication about what's happening is important. So I'll give you a quick maybe tour of the template editor. Another cool feature here while we're in the debugger mode is that we can also, like, in addition to tracing through, this workflow execution, we can also preview all of the individual messages sent. So for us to QA this process, because like, obviously, if I flip back over to Cursor real quick, and sorry to keep hopping back and forth, but you can see here, like, there are quite a lot of scenarios that we need to account for in our different messaging, right? So we've got 2 different plan types, 2 different metrics. And for each one of those metrics, we've got 3 different thresholds. So, like 12 total scenarios that we need to plan around and make sure that, we're communicating as clearly as we can, like what you've done, where you're at with each one of those metrics, and like what the downstream effects are. So here in the debugger, we can actually preview each one of those messages. And see exactly what gets sent to the user. And then right now I've actually got all this stuff set to sandbox mode in my dev environment. So I'm sort of like generating this message in Knock, but not actually sending it downstream to Postmark, which ultimately allows me to kind of like save on messenger costs and that as we're doing some dev work. But let me hop you in one of these templates real quick, and we can take a look at maybe this one. and edit the content. And so we can, in this template editor, like mix different types of content. So here we've got some dynamic markdown, which contains just like a ton of different liquid, so that we're making all of this language here dynamic. And then we can combine that with HTML so that we can do something more styled, like this message meter right here. And then we've also got this concept of like reusable email partials. And so that's what each one of these bars are. So we got a lot of work to do here, and we're launching some cool stuff in relation to this. But just the idea that, you know, some of this messaging piece can be really complex. Obviously, we want to make this as accessible to as many folks as we can, and not just developers for at least this part. And so this allows us to do that, where we can have a developer come in, create these sort of nice reusable components for an email, and then allow somebody else to use them.
I appreciate, you know, you're not showing us production code, you're showing us the demo. But what I'm guessing you've learned from the production environment and the assets you need to build reliable functionality. You had a bunch of fixtures there for all the different scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other tips you've got during like the iterations you're doing of development, or your CI/CD flow to make sure that you're not introducing any new bugs, like common acceptance tests that you run, or unit tests or integration tests?
That's actually a great question. Let me go back to here. So this is actually something that we had for a long time and have only sort of recently introduced using it to power these downstream messaging events. So like in terms of production, like things I would think about when implementing this with actual users is like understanding what are reasonable thresholds based on your usage patterns here. And so that was something we did, was like looking at our individual usage patterns. And so before we determined that 75, 90, and 100 were like appropriate. So we did a little bit of analysis there. And then I'll be honest, like I think most of what we learned was just around the actual context of the messaging, because this is, you know, you see lots of, I think, scenarios out there in, you know, the dev ecosystem, right, where billing emails can be handled poorly. And people can have negative reactions to getting surprise bills, surprise overages. So just making sure that these things function well has been really important to us. And part of that is like we can use the observability features in Knock to do some of that. And then obviously also, like I mentioned, we produce a lot of webhooks. So having something to consume those message events, like sending them through to a Hookdeck and then storing them in a database is one option, or like integrating some of this stuff with Datadog so that you can kind of immediately react if you see, you know, the error rate on these types of workflows go up.
And centralized observability across all the different systems and components,
Correct.
Right? Yeah, it makes sense. Okay. So do you have a lot, can you trigger some events and see things flowing or
yeah,
or is this
we can come back here, and I mean, and it was sort of, we can just rerun different parts of this demo. And so like, obviously we can test some of these different scenarios. So we could kick somebody up to a starter plan and then say, I want to trigger, you know, these in-app messages. And we'll just sort of click the button up until we sort of start to breach our threshold.
Yeah, they've now got 50,000. Oh no, sorry. Okay, so
so this is 2,500 for monthly notified recipients for our guides product. And so, like I said, these are two very different metrics. And like one, you've got like a lot of volume because those are individual messages. Where on the other hand, you know, you might not have as much volume for this guides product down here, but you can show as many of them as you want. And cool, let's go ahead and burst that. And then, yeah, we should be able to come back into our workflow and click into workflow runs. Might need to just refresh real quick. Cool. And then we should be able to like see all of those. And again, they all kind of happen within, you know, a band because we're doing a demo, but in reality, these would probably be a little bit more spread out. And so here we can see, you know, that first one, you know, if we trace through here, and again, like we really wanted to help with the observability product, like we built a lot of that into Knock because I think, when you have just sort of like a direct integration with SendGrid and all of your logic lives in code, it's sometimes really hard to answer the question like, why did or didn't this person get a notification? And so using this, you can really actually come through here and look at each one of these steps and, determine exactly why we decided to send this message. So if we preview this one, this is kind of just like our, hey, heads up, you've used, 77%, like we're not doing anything. There's no red anywhere. This is just basically for your information, right? So that as downstream, as you kind of continue, if we come back into, let's see, we go workflow runs. Yeah, if we come back to, the one where you actually have breached this and it bursted your limit. We can, we show you a totally different message, change the way that we present this, introduce talking about the overage so that you're not surprised as you get billed, or that your bill this month might be a little bit more. And so a lot of it, I think, was determining just like the dynamic language of this, as you saw with some of those liquid templates.
And you said at the minute you're in sandbox mode, so it's not triggering kind of these I don't know what you call them. The interaction with postmark.
Correct. Yeah. And so another thing that you can kind of do in here with the observability piece is come through and like step through the different message events and see exactly, what happened as, our system processed through this workflow. So we created the message, queued the message, and then here you can see that it wasn't sent. And then because it's in sandbox mode, but if we would have sent this would have been, message sent to the postmark. And then we also store all of those downstream provider logs so that you can see exactly what postmark sent back. So if there are errors, again, you can like bubble those up into your Datadog, into your observability products. And then we also track a bunch of downstream message events that are determined by the provider, right? So we obviously send it, pass it off to postmark, but then we also can track whether or not it was delivered. And then that generates a message event and a webhook. And then if a user opens it or clicks a link and you have both of those tracking features enabled, those are separate message events that you would see represented here. And then, could like filter those down through, like whatever webhook ingestion software you want to use, or Datadog, or we've got like data warehouse sync as well, so that you can like analyze all of that stuff and, include it with all of your other customer engagement data.
Okay. So in this dev mode that you're in at the minute, then do you actually have that Next.js application running on your machine right now?
This one?
Yeah. Right. So
yeah.
So this is you're triggering the fake orb events here. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So basically, I just mocked this where as I click the button and breach those thresholds, we, receive the fake orb event that would correspond to that. And then, we do our transformation.
So you're not having to do you're not having to use the Hookdeck CLI to expose, a tunnel to orb, because ultimately you're mocking everything local, and then you're just integrating directly to knock via that, as you say, that trigger.
Yeah.
Call.
Correct.
Right. Okay.
And then the one other thing I'll call out on the knock side that's kind of interesting is, so like, one of the things, I didn't mock this up here, but we do also basically have the ability to, on our trigger type, you can set a JSON schema so that at least when we ingest stuff from knock, or like when knock ingests a workflow trigger, you can specify basically the shape of this payload. And that if it doesn't match that schema, obviously it can throw an error and trigger Datadog or something like that. So if you're getting, a bad source event from something, you absolutely have the ability to go in there and specify, this is the shape that I expect. Because obviously a bunch of this data drives all this dynamic templating. And, we've all seen horror stories about how the $ curly brace first name, email shows up in your inbox.
And then what do you do for kind of failures within your workflow? Say, what do you call the individual pieces within a workflow?
So these are called channel steps, and they produce templates.
Okay. So then what do you do if like one of those fails and it's in whether it's in development? I guess it doesn't really matter, you're in sandbox mode, but what happens if something like that somehow fails, something downstream fails in production? Can you retry or re-ingest the event somehow? Or
Not automatically, no. And I think the mode of the failure depends a little bit.
Yeah.
Because like, so if in this instance they send a malformed payload and let's say there's like a liquid rendering failure, that kind of just fails the message step, and you could, use that as an alert to your system to retry that message on your own from your own system. Now the downstream provider stuff, if we were to pass that message off to SendGrid or Postmark, that there is this kind of like retryability feature of some of those channel steps, depending on the error code that we receive back from the provider.
Right. Okay. So if you're getting a 429, it's an obvious.
Yeah. We back off and,
yeah. Okay. Got you.
Yeah. But if we get, certain, and not so much with email, but more so with like SMS, where it's like this phone number's not valid or it's bounced, or, the person's basically like said, stop sending me text messages. Some of those things will just trigger an automatic message bounce event. And then we would, emit that webhook or send that event to like Datadog.
Yeah. Okay. Got you. So I'm assuming that's the demo, like end-to-end coverage. You showed triggering the events. You've talked about the architecture. You've talked about triggering the events. You've covered this kind of two different scenarios.
Yep.
We've worked through the flow. You've talked about configurability. You've talked about the debugging, the observability you're providing. You mentioned that you can also pipe this information into things like Datadog. Mm-hmm. Is there anything else you would point out about either the kind of development workflows, or could you share a little bit about what the production environment might look like if it looks any different? Like, how do you convert this into a production environment? Is it a toggle, or do you kind of duplicate it and move it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for this right now, this is all in my development environment. And one of the things that we can do with Knock is like, again, being like we started really as like a developer first, more notification infrastructure product, and have since moved to like trying to solve a broader messaging use case across different roles of an org. But one of the things that we were definitely built around was the idea that we wanted to like fit seamlessly into your developer workflow. And so there are a couple of ways that works in Knock. Like obviously you can see I'm up in this developer environment. I'm on this main branch. And so we actually have sort of these affordances to allow you to model this a little bit more closely to like your software development lifecycle. So right now I'm doing this all off the main branch, but if I wanted to, I could have created an entirely separate branch of development to like do all of my testing. And then when I'm ready, I can actually merge all of that code back in. And then here you can see this button will allow me to commit these changes to development. And so when you commit a workflow change, under the hood, all of our resources are basically just JSON config files. So the workflow itself is defined in JSON, which allows you to interact with it through our API or our CLI. And then also like all of the message templates are obviously sort of file-based things that we store on our servers so that you can, interact with them in the same way. But when you make changes to a particular workflow, so let me actually come out here and we'll just make a quick change to, I'll just add something silly here, click Save Changes. And then if we commit, now we should get this nice diff of, hey, here was the before state, here's the after state of what I just changed. So I could say update subject and go ahead and commit that to development. And then if I wanted to, I can also sort of promote it up into my production environment. And that's basically, how with this you would delineate and how we were able to do a bunch of testing before we got to production. So we built a bunch of this in our development environment and then committed and promoted it to production. And then, a lot of that's driven by the API key that you use. And so in our production application over here, that's sending messages or triggering workflows in our production Knock instance. And then our, infra dev environment is doing it against development so that we can kind of test those two things independently.
Okay. Is it inspired by the Git development flow, or is it stored in Git? Like as a developer, can I access actually these config files stored in Git somewhere?
So I would say it's mostly inspired, but you can also do a more Git-centric workflow. And we have a lot of people do that with our CLI. And so like let me just come out here, developer tools, and I'll just hop into our docs right here. And so you can definitely integrate us directly into your CI/CD pipeline. And we do have a number of people who do that. And then the benefit there is that I could have pulled down all these resources and I just have a .knock folder with a bunch of workflow.json files. And then the CLI. And then what that allows me to do is use our MCP server, like Cursor, to develop my templates, all of that really cool stuff. And then when I'm ready, I can just push it back up into whatever environment I want. And again, I think we see like a lot of variation in how people approach this. And it's not an all or nothing sort of scenario. So some people will have some workflows stored in GitHub and do that process. Others of them won't be and will be manually controlled. And then like when you have other people in here, like product managers, marketers, like there's also the ability to just sort of create stuff directly in production if that's easier for some
But
roles.
still with the supported workflow that reduces the chances of mistakes, but allows a rollback back if somebody does do something. Yeah, okay,
correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Cool.
Okay, yeah, great. That's the workflow. That's the architecture.
Yeah.
I mean, diving a little bit back into the code, your custom application does do some custom functionality, enriches your data, then it pushes it into the knock workflow. Is there anything in there, kind of gotchas? Did you implement idempotency, things like that? I mean, I'm guessing in your production, whether you've done that in the demo application or not, any kind of gotchas or recommendations in terms of the handling the webhooks perspective?
No, but you just now, after you said that, I'm going to go suggest that we include an idempotency key on some of these workflow triggers, because that is a great idea. And I think in a scenario like this, and so we do support that. Knock does support an idempotency key, so that if I pass that, right, I'm only going to end up triggering that set of notifications once.
Yeah.
But I don't know that we actually did that in production. And so if nothing else, as a part of this session, you've improved our handling of webhooks.
But as you say, I think if knock deployed supports that, but it's up to you when you construct the payload to make sure you've got the idempotency key.
Yep.
As long as you've but you need to configure that in the trigger. Is that right?
Correct.
Right, okay.
Yeah, I believe it's just an idempotency key field here, and then we would construct that as whatever we want. And like if there is, let's see, what would be a good thing
something
here?
from orb.
Yeah, probably something from orb, right? They would hopefully give us an ID.
Yeah,
Let's see what they got. Do I still have it open? A subscription. I would hope there would be some sort of unique ID on there.
Yeah, may well be in the header information.
Yeah,
because it's kind of meta, isn't it? So
yeah. No, but that's actually a great suggestion and something that we should implement, because we absolutely do support it for that exact reason.
Right. Okay.
So
well, that's great to know within your product that is supported, because that's obviously a massive gotcha when working with events, when working with webhooks.
For sure, and especially when you're relying on some sort of external system to trigger some of those events, right? And I guess that's also something, right, that Hookdeck would solve for as well, right?
Yeah, we can do deduplication.
Okay.
So you can configure a rule which is, as we're ingesting events, deduplication, but we still have a window for that. We don't retain data and look up like millions of events. We'll go, okay. Well, we'll look at that for an hour. But ultimately, when handling webhooks in the downstream processing systems, you really should be going, okay, have I processed this event already? So the fact that Knock does support that makes it, a great solution for that problem.
Yeah, and we've just got to go do it ourselves now. So I'll go spin up a Devon to add that. We'll get it cooking.
Okay. Well, I mean, I guess that's a good tip and gotcha. I guess any final resources or pointers you would provide to anybody that's watching this?
I mean, our docs are a great place to get started. And obviously, a lot of this I think is just knitting together various resources. So I don't know that there's really one great place for me to point you in terms of Knock. And just, obviously coming down here, if you look at our, triggering workflows docs, that's going to get you with an API key. That's going to get you kind of most of what I've got here. And I think a lot of that on the other end is just you figuring out what's being sent.
And then anything from the webhooks that you use. So we talked about, enriching webhook data and pushing it into Knock to support workflows. But what about on the other side where you're triggering webhooks? Is there any resources that?
Yeah. So let me show you what those look like, because I do think that's an interesting. So we also support outbound webhooks, and so these are based on message events, and we have support all these different message event types, and basically what we do on the back end is sort of normalize all of these different statuses across all of the different provider types, so that you kind of have like one canonical message, and then that may have any one of these statuses, and we sort of talk through, what that means for each one. And so, yeah, being able to consume these, and again, like just thinking about where Hookdeck would actually help people, right? Because like you send one message, right? So we're going to do a message send event. You might get a delivered event, depending on what somebody does with it. You might have any one of these interaction events. So for, if you're sending millions of messages, you're 5 or 6x possible events that you may need to consume from our outbound webhooks. So it tends to be a lot of volume.
Yeah. And then the same things in terms we just talked about, like best handling practices, idempotency, supporting local development, which you could use the Hookdeck CLI for that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Making sure you can handle the volume that's coming out. And I'm assuming you support some sort of retry mechanism.
On the webhooks, I believe so. Yeah, we can double check, and if not,
you support disabling a webhook, which in itself is an amazing feature, because many times you can't programmatically manage webhooks from providers. So for instance, if you've got some problem downstream when you're saying, hang on, you keep sending me events, I can't deal with them. At least you can turn it off and say, and stop the service attacking me.
And so, yeah, this was my gut, but I just wanted to confirm. So yeah, we do have built-in retries, and I think it just follows basically the same pattern that a lot of our other retry logic does, which is just exponential back off, up to 8 times. And so, this first couple will come kind of quickly, but we'll try to prevent that like thundering herd sort of scenario when we're sending you webhooks, and also as we're sending a lot of these API calls to like the downstream providers as well.
Well, great. We've covered inbound and outbound, some good best practices. I think also, very clear understanding of the value that Knock brings, both in terms of from a business perspective, but also from a development workflow perspective. So, thank you for the time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.